I've been on a hot streak lately with terrible medical cases, full of horrible infections and disfiguring injuries. And today, I bring you another gut-wrenching installment in this morbid series. And today's news really takes the cake. Everything about this case is horrible. The identity of the patient has not been publicized, but the details of their infection have been reported in a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. But before we get into the medical case, let's set the stage by looking at some background information. There's two things that I want to touch on here: necrotizing fasciitis and the Aeromonas hydrophylla bacteria. Now, this bacteria, this Aeromonas hydrophylla, is a low-key infectious rod-shaped bacteria that typically infects fish and amphibians, but in humans, it normally isn't really all that dangerous. In a healthy human, strains of A. hydrophylla create small, mild, localized infections. They don't tend to spread across the body via the bloodstream, and they don't tend to infect multiple organs, and the infections themselves aren't long-lasting or particularly severe, as they tend to be wiped out by the immune system relatively quickly. In the vast majority of cases of A. hydrophylla infection, the worst symptoms are diarrhea or eczema. But in those rare, tiny minority of cases that go bad, it goes really bad. A serious Aeromonas hydrophylla infection can cause gas gangrene, which is horrible and disgusting, and it can also cause necrotizing fasciitis, which is even worse. In cases of necrotizing fasciitis, a bacterial infection basically eats your flesh. Huge chunks of soft tissue get red and inflamed as they're chemically dissolved at a cellular level. Dead tissue turns brown, and then black, and then rots away, leaving behind a cratered, rotten mass of sickly, wet flesh. Necrotizing fasciitis can destroy limbs, ruin organs, and end lives. Now we come to today's medical case. The patient in question was in a motorcycle accident, and their damaged limbs came into contact with stagnant water, which then became infected and went septic within the day. This exposure resulted in an Aeromonas hydrophylla infection, which made its way into the patient's liver and spleen, and from here, the bacteria was able to spread throughout the patient's body. Now at first, doctors thought that it was a monomicrobial infection. That is to say that they thought it was just one species, or one type of bacteria. Now, they were right that it was one species, it was this Aeromonas hydrophylla, but it was a polymicrobial infection because the patient had 4 different strains of Aeromonas in their body. So when they came into contact with that stagnant water, they weren't infected with just one strain, they were infected with 4 strains. Rita Colwell is a microbiologist at the University of Maryland, and she worked on the patient's case. Ms. Colwell said, quote, "The simple diagnostic was that it was an Aeromonas hydrophylla infection, but in fact, it was far more complicated than that. This is a clear demonstration of a polymicrobial infection, and it was highly subtle in that it was 2 strains of the same species. One of the strains produces an enzyme that breaks down tissue that essentially allows the other to migrate into the system and infect the liver and spleen." Unquote. Alright, so I said that there was 4 strains, right? And the quote from Miss Colwell here, she mentioned that there was only 2 strains. Well, the reality of it is that there were 4 strains, but 2 of them were pretty easily dealt with by the patient's immune system, so they weren't really a part of this horrible acceleration of the disease. There was 2 other strains that worked symbiotically to really destroy the patient's body, and these are the 2 strains that she's talking about. So, after some genetic analysis, the doctors found that 3 of these 4 strains were very similar, and they were largely contained by the immune system, except for one of them. But that other strain, that 4th strain that wasn't genetically similar, that was a little different. And that 4th strain released some toxins that made the other strain far more pathogenic. Specifically, the dangerous strain that the doctors called NF2 released a toxin that burned into the muscle tissue, breaking it down and opening up the vascular tissue, opening up the blood vessels. This allowed that second strain that's involved in this horrible accelerating infection, one that the doctors called NF1, to slip into the bloodstream and then spread throughout the body. So normally NF1 is pathogenic, but normally it can be contained. Like if it's not in the bloodstream, it's not going to be that damaging. It can be contained by the immune system relatively effectively. But the NF2 strain released a toxin that degraded muscle tissue. It ate through the muscle tissue. And this opened up the blood vessels, and that allowed NF1 to get inside. And there, this normally relatively weak strain was suddenly able to attack from the inside and cause a ton of damage. And so from here, where NF1 was inside the bloodstream, the disease progressed rapidly, manifesting in body-wide necrotizing fasciitis. Tissue necrosis began to manifest in every limb in the patient's body, and their life was put at risk in just a matter of hours. The doctors had no choice but to take extreme action, and the patient underwent a quadruple amputation. Both legs were removed below the knee, so as to stop the necrotizing fasciitis in their feet, and both arms were removed below the elbow, so as to stop the necrotizing fasciitis in the hands. This was an extreme measure, but it was necessary to save the patient's life. Otherwise, if they didn't do this and the necrotizing fasciitis would have spread throughout their body, the bacteria would have consumed them from the inside out. They would have rotted from the inside and suffered organ failure, sepsis, toxic shock syndrome, and eventually death. Now, in my previous science news segments on all of these intense and disgusting medical cases, they've generally had a happy ending, as the patient survived and went on to live a generally normal life. Now, this case is a little different, because even though the patient survived, they're now a quadruple amputee, and there's no way to downplay how massive and traumatic such a change would be to one's lifestyle and quality of life. But at the end of the day, at least the patient is still alive.